All right. So welcome you all to this book series presentation on heroic Hindu resistance to Muslim invaders. Today we have Lakshmi Prasad J, who will be telling us about the third chapter of the book. So we already covered in the last 3 weeks the first two chapters. So maybe we can just get started. So.
Thanks, Arnab. Before I start sharing my screen, I have made certain maps on Google Maps for which I'll have to switch between Chrome and the PPT. So is it something possible on Zoom? Or
Yes,
should
I
we?
think you can share your entire screen, not just one application. So you can keep sharing.
Oh,
So whatever.
so when I switch between applications, you will be able to see, right?
Yes, yes. Otherwise, you have to keep sharing,
Yes.
stop sharing, and keep another thing.
Okay,
Yeah.
let me try that.
Yeah. So just share your screen. When the options come, when you share the first one, the screen, use the screen and not the window. So then it will work.
Right. So
Yeah,
you
we
can.
can see.
You can see, right? Okay. Let me
Right.
try and toggle between this one and the Google Chrome.
You may try that.
Okay. I can. Can you see the maps?
No, no.
No.
I think you can only see one screen at a time.
Okay. Okay. You can. You're seeing the title slide right now.
Yes, yes, yes.
Right.
Okay.
Can you share? Can you try now? Because in presentation mode, sometimes it doesn't work. Can you try now?
Can you see something else now, or is?
It is.
Screen is
No.
trying to change, but I think it's
Yes.
stuck in between.
Okay. Okay.
So in the non-presentation
Okay.
mode, sometimes it lets you change that.
Okay. Okay. I'll try and pull in some maps and see if it works. But otherwise, I'll just explain it. Okay. Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me. Today, the chapter that we're going to discuss is about the Ghazni invasion into India. What we have been taught, mostly in our schools and our history books, is that the Ghaznavids, especially the Mahmud of Ghazni and his father Sabuktajin, and much later the Mahmud of Ghori, they invaded India multiple times. They plundered our temples. They conquered all our wealth and took it back to their home country, which is Ghazni and Ghori in Afghanistan. And this entire episode is narrated as if there's hardly any resistance from the Hindu side. In fact, I've never heard of any resistance from Hindu side in our history textbooks. But the reality, as you can understand, the whole purpose of this book and the book written by Dr. Ram Gopal Mishra is to bring out those aspects which are completely ignored by traditional historians, right? So Mahmud of Ghazni was the Amir of Ghazna in Afghanistan. It's a province in Afghanistan which they conquer at the time his father Sabuktajin conquers Kabul and Zabul, right? Now from there, Mahmud of Ghazni's intention is to invade India. When I say India, he wants to come to the Sindh part. So his initial idea was to conquer Sindh. And when I say Sindh, particularly the city of Multan, Multan is a prosperous city from the times of Alexander. Now he wants to, not even Alexander actually, even prior to Alexander, even the Achaemenid Empire wanted to conquer Multan. It's a very rich city, and this is what he wanted to conquer. And so, I mean, the couple of myths that we already discussed is that Muhammad Ghazni was only an invader. He was never interested in establishing a kingdom in India, unlike the Mughals and unlike the Delhi Sultans, who became Indians and who established kingdoms in India and ruled India. That's the first myth. The second myth is that there's absolutely no resistance from the Indian side, the Hindus especially, and it was an open country which Muhammad could enter and exit as and when he leaves. Now, what is the truth? The truth is, did Hindu kings resist invasions? Yes, of course they did. It was never recorded. Now, who resists the invasions of Mahmud of Ghazni? We have at least 4 kingdoms that resisted, that fought back the Mahmud of Ghazni. We have the Hindu Shahis. These are the kings of Afghanistan who were pushed into the present-day Pakistan by the incursions of Sabukta Jin, who is Mahmud of Ghazni's father. Now they are settled in Pakistan in a place called Udbhandapur, which is called Hund now in Pakistan. And then Muhammad of Ghazni was also confronted, and it was given a very tough fight by the Rajput Confederacy. Now, Hindu Shahis and Rajputs, they entered into an alliance, and they fight Muhammad of Ghazni. Then the Chandelas, Chandelas from the famous the kings of central India in Madhya Pradesh. Khajuraho and Kalinjar are their capitals. And the Chalukyas of Gujarat also fought fiercely with Muhammad of Ghazni. I wish I can share my screen. Again, I switched my screen. Can you see something different?
No.
Yeah, the whole screen is visible now. Whole slide.
No, not
Okay.
the.
See the slide that says Hindu kings resist.
Okay, let me stop sharing for a bit, and I'll share a different screen, and let's see if it works.
Yes.
Okay, what can you see now?
Yes, on the Google My Maps, yeah. Ghazi
Yeah.
Multan. Yes.
Correct.
The map, yes.
Okay, I'm just opening the map. At any point, if your screen doesn't refresh, let me know. Can you see the map with A, B, C, D, E?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So the point number A is where Ghazna is, or Ghazni is. This is the place where which is completely under the control of the Turkish people, Sabukta Jin and his son Mahmud of Ghazni. So Mahmud of Ghazni was made the Amir of Ghazni when he fought with the Hindu Shahis, the earlier Hindu Shahis. Now from here, they captured Kabul, which I think Vijit covered last time. Now the idea is to come to here in Multan, right? They want to conquer this city, which is a part of Sindh currently in Pakistan. Now the route for them is from Kabul to on the way lies this part called Udbhandapur. Now it is called Hund. The current name is Hund in Pakistan. Right now, here this is where the Hindu Shahi kings are now. They made it their capital. Now, Peshawar is right there in the outskirts of Hund. It was not a big city at that point in time compared to Hund. Hund was a bigger city. Now, Muhammad of Ghazni had to cross this part and then push further, cross the river Indus here, and then go south to Multan. Now, we don't know exactly which route he took after Hund, but the idea is, I mean, if I take a walking path on Google Maps, this is what it shows, and probably this is the route that he must have followed. Now, in order to get there, he has to cross Hund, and that's where he came in conflict with the Hindu Shahi king Jayapala. Now again, I'll stop sharing and share something else. Right. Before we get there, why conquer Multan in the first place, and what is the history? I'll go a little back in history, go back to the early historical times, and see what is the history of this region. Can you see my slides back again?
Yes.
Okay. So the map here, you can see this is exactly how it looked before Alexander came all the way from Macedon to India. Now this part from the Mediterranean Sea all the way up to the Indus River, which is the red part you see here. Now this was under the Achaemenid rule, which is the Persian Empire at that time. It's a huge empire, and they tried conquering this Sindh part of India for 200 years. Now they met with only mixed success. While they were able to conquer all the way up till Egypt, and you know, all this Iraq and Syria and Babylon and all that, they're able to hold the Sindh part for only a few years, because the hill tribes of Sindh, who later we know Parvateshwar or Porus and Ambhi, and you know, these smaller kings of the northwest frontier of India around Sindh, they fought back the great Achaemenid Empire and they declared independence. Now at that point, and why did Achaemenid Empire again wanted to conquer Sindh? If you see, you know, this is the revenue coming from various regions during the Achaemenid rule. You can see the largest bubble or the largest circle is from the Sindh part. So the largest revenue is being collected from here, even though they were able to hold this region for a very short period. This region is very rich and it is contributing a lot of money. Now, this is exactly the reason why Alexander marched all the way from Macedon to India. He wanted to enter India. Now, the Achaemenids were not able to penetrate into India, hold Sindh for a long time, and they never crossed Indus and ventured further. Because again, here I'm trying to point out the Hindu resistance or Indian resistance at that point in time. Now, the same region was covered by Alexander, and Alexander's invasion of India is a failed one. As you can see, he had to stop at the river Indus and go back. Now, the Greek historians say that Alexander and his army had been away from their homes for a long time, and they felt homesick and they wanted to go home. But that's not the case. Megasthenes explicitly says that, you know, the battle with Parvateshwara or Porus blunted their courage. And when they heard about a kingdom to the east, which is much, much bigger, which is the Magadha kingdom, right? Which has like thousands and thousands of cavalry and elephants and all that. They lost their nerve and they had to make a, they had to make a retreat in haste. So the Achaemenids couldn't enter India. The Alexander couldn't enter India. Now, what we are taught in school and what historians typically, parrot is that a small king from Afghanistan, Ghazni, is able to enter India and conquer all of, defeat all the Indian kings and take a lot of plunder. No, that's not true. The Ghazni is actually the Ghaznimid Empire is actually as big as Alexander Empire, as we'll see later. But the intention of Ghazni was very well to establish a kingdom in India. He wanted to establish a kingdom in India. He wanted to take taxes and collect tributes from the Indian region, which is rich. It is the same principle that led the Achaemenids to invade India, the same principle that led the Greeks to invade India, and so on and so forth. And that's the reason he made 17 raids into India. Most of them were unsuccessful. And he had to take a retreat every time, and he had to go back to safety, or safety of Ghazni every time he came. Now, what is the Ghaznimid Empire? So what is the kind of army that the Hindus were facing at that point in time? It's not the small, province of Ghazni and a small army of horseback riders coming into India and able to topple the great Rajputs and Chandelas and all that. If you look at the Ghaznavid Empire in this map, it is almost the size of the Achaemenid Empire at its peak. It is almost the size of the Macedonian Empire at its peak. From Afghanistan, current day Afghanistan, all the way up till the Saudi Arabia, Abbasid Caliphate, and Iran, entire Iran is under it, and it's all the way up till Iraq. Now, Baghdad is the seat of Abbasid Caliphate. Abbasid Caliphate is at that point in time the greatest empire, trying to topple the Byzantine Empire, which is a Christian empire. Now, it is the weight of this empire that invaded India. It's not just a small, party of horseback raiders that came into India. Now, who are the ones who fought with these, with this great army? Now, Jayapala, the Hindu Shahi king, who, as I said earlier, who was stationed at Udbhandapura as his capital in Pakistan, which is currently in Pakistan. he was totally unaware of the Ghaznavid invasion, and because Ghazni wanted to go to Multan and he had to cross Udbhandpur, when his army reached the gates of Peshawar, that's when Raja Jaipala realizes that he has an enemy at his gates. Now, being so unprepared, he was still able to give a very tough fight. He was able to mobilize his army, and in the battle, he loses. He loses to Muhammad of Ghazni. But again, it's a what we call a Pyrrhic victory, which is a tough victory for Ghazni, because he was not able to uh, go any further from Peshawar, because his entire army got exhausted. Even that victory meant nothing. He was not even able to collect any tax from the defeated party. So Raja Jaipala, a small king, he was able to stop the entire Ghaznavid army, and Muhammad of Ghazni had to return to Ghazna. So his intention of getting to Multan never fructified during the reign of Jaipala. Now, after Muhammad leaves back to Ghazni, Raja Jaipala, having he ascends on a pyre and lights it himself, and he commits suicide. Now, that is the kind of honor that Hindu kings stood for at that point in time, because he, as a king, as a Raja, his dharma was to protect his kingdom, and because he was inadvertent and he didn't foresee the Ghaznavid invasion, and which resulted in the loss of his people and also his wealth, he sets himself on fire. Now, this kind of this sense of honor you will not see anywhere in the Muslim world throughout history. Even in the times of Medina, when Muhammad was ruling from Medina, uh, in the face of a defeat, Muhammad clearly said that if you sense a defeat, make a treaty with the invaders and make peace. He didn't give his life for Medina. So now Raja Jayapala was succeeded by his son Anandapala. Now Muhammad again came after 5 years to again reach Multan. Now again he was stopped by Jayapala's son Anandapala. Now again Anandapala loses this battle, and his son Sukhpala was taken as a prisoner, and he's converted to Islam. And Muhammad goes back to Ghazni. Again, he goes back to Ghazni because he couldn't move any further from there, because the battle resulted in such a loss that he's not in a position to make any further advance. So he had to go back and replenish and come back. As soon as Muhammad goes back to Ghazni, his son reverts back to Hinduism.
প্লান্ডার করেছিল না প্রচুর, আমরা সেটাই পড়েছি, কিন্তু সেটা কিভাবে
Yeah. So as soon as Muhammad goes back to Ghazni, Sukhpala, who was earlier converted to Islam, he reverts back to Hinduism. And Muhammad at that point in time had to take care of an incursion from the western side of his kingdom. So he goes on an expedition to the west side. Now that is the time when the Hindu Shahis could have attacked Ghazni and took control of Ghazni. But Anandapala is too magnanimous that he would never do such a thing. He would not pursue an enemy when he's engaged elsewhere. So that's a lost chance. Now we play by rules, right? So we have our dharma in mind at every point, which didn't work in our favor in certain cases. So instead he offered Muhammad some help in his western campaign. Now what happens is, here he is helping Muhammad in his western campaign, but when Muhammad comes back, settles the dispute and comes back to Ghazni, he again starts a fight with Muhammad. So this is a logic that normal war strategists can't understand. Why help an enemy and again fight him back? Because that is what dharma is all about, right? So dharmic yuddha is about that. Now when Muhammad settles the dispute in his western borders and comes back to Ghazni, and again he tries to go to Multan. So the price is Multan. The price is sin. If you conquer sin, then you'll be able to collect a huge tribute because it's a very rich and fertile region. So Muhammad again wanted to go back through the same route. I'll probably show you the screen again. So again, he wants he comes all the way from Ghazni to Kabul to Peshawar, and here again there is Utbandapur, and he wants to go back to Multan. Now this time Anandapala, the king of Hindu Shahis, he forms a confederacy with the Rajputs who are further to the east of India. So I'll also show that map. Yeah. Can you see the map?
Yes.
Okay. So this time, Anandapala, he's again seated here, close to Peshawar. Now he forms a confederacy with the Hindu kings of Delhi, and here you have Ajmer, Ujjain, Gwalior, Kanauj, and again, so they all of them form a confederacy, and they march all the way to Peshawar. So they send their forces to Peshawar. Now here, a pitted battle happens, and Muhammad was almost, Muslim historians note this, that Muhammad of Ghazni is almost at the face of defeat. Now he's, I mean, this is a chance that we could have killed him, but probably luck is on his side. Now he directs one of his soldiers to go and injure the elephant on which King Anandapala was seated. So Indian kings the king always had an elephant vehicle, and he used to sit on top of that, and he used to survey the battlefield and guide from there. Whereas these Turks, they don't have elephants, right? So they come on short Central Asian horses, and you can't really differentiate between a king and a soldier because everyone looks the same and everyone has a horse. And the advantage here for them is that horses are a lot more nimble, and they can see, this is what we call guerrilla tactics, right? So they were doing these guerrilla tactics. They would confront the enemy from the front side, and then when they realize that they are not strong enough, they'll run away, and then they'll come back from behind and do all sorts of maneuvers, which is unheard of in Indian warfare. You look at Mahabharata, Kurukshetra, they all happen. They all have pretty strict codes of fighting. Now he directs one of his soldiers to go from behind and injure the elephant that Anandapala is seated on. So he shoots a naphtha ball at the elephant, and the elephant gets scared, and it starts running. Hitter and hitter. So it basically turns back and runs away. Now this is the Rajput, other Rajput generals. They see this as a symbol of a retreating king, so that they lose their morale, and they pretty much the army gets dispersed. So something that was a sure shot victory becomes a sad tale for us. Now, what is the result of this? The result of this is, again, I'll go back to my slide. Sorry for that. Now, the result of this is that Muhammad of Ghazni is still not able to take Multan. So his prize, which he wanted to acquire Multan, he still is not able to acquire that. He had to go back again to Ghazni. So when we hear about Ghazni invading India 17 times, this is what happened. I mean, although Indians, the Hindus, did not have a resounding victory over him, even he didn't have a proper victory over us. He had to go empty-handed every time. Now, Anandapala's son is Trilochanapala. Now, after this battle, the Hindu Shahis retreat to Kashmir. So they cross over the hills and they get into Kashmir, because Trilochanapala's mother is probably a Kashmiri princess. So the Kashmir king was, in good terms with them, and they gave him shelter. And from there, they again make a attack. When next time when Muhammad tries to go to Multan via that route in 1013 AD, the Trilochan Pala, along with the Kashmiri army, again they fight. This time, the Muslim chroniclers, they say that for several days, Muhammad was not able to make any gains in the battle. He was able to gain a victory over the Hindus only when they had to come to the plain fields. So as long as they were in the hills of Kashmir, he was not able to do anything. So Kalhana, who wrote Rajatarangani, he says, I'm reading a translation here. So even after even after Muhammad had obtained his victory, the Hamira, which means the Amir, did not breathe freely, thinking of the superhuman prowess of the illustrious Trilochanapala. Again, he had to go back. He was denied his right of way to Multan. He was not allowed to go to Multan, and he was stopped in the tracks. I'll probably show you the map that I put for this battle. Sorry for switching. I actually wanted to embed these maps in the PowerPoint, but apparently it requires an add-in, which I don't have. Yeah, so the point number B is where the Hindu Shahs move after Trilochanapala sends Muhammad back again. Of course, the Indians lose the battle, but Muhammad again was denied his right of way to Multan. So they come to a place called Nandana or Nandana, which is a salt flat, and they are being supported by the king of Kashmir, who is seated in Srinagar, and again his frontier is here in Pir Panjal. So from here they're sending armies, and this part is being reinforced. The Nandana fort is being reinforced. Right. So now Trilochanapala's son is Bhimapala, and by this time they have established themselves at Lohara or Lohkot, which is on the border of Kashmir, I just showed you. And Muhammad again tries to storm Lohkot. But from the Muslim accounts, we get to know that this is the first disaster for Sultan Muhammad, because the battle ended in losses for the Muslim party, and Muhammad had to again go back to Ghazni. For obvious reasons, Dr. Misra says that the contemporary Muslim historians, they do not speak much about it, but it's not, you can guess it from the silence what would have happened. In fact, Kalhana in Rajatarangini, he mentions this battle, and he says it's a resounding success for the Hindus. Now, for so many attempts, he just wanted to go to Multan and conquer it, and he's not being allowed by small kings. This is not Magadha Empire. This is not the Cholas or the larger kingdoms of India. These are smaller Hindu Shahis who are situated in the northwestern border of India. Okay. Now, Trilochanapala and his son Bhimapala, I mean, this is my words, it's not in the book. When I was reading the book, I thought that these guys have acted as the Great Wall of India. Now, as long as Trilochanapala and Bhimapala were alive, they didn't allow Muhammad to cross over their territory and take over Multan. They fought with Muhammad after this particular battle at Lohkot. They fought multiple times. They stopped his armies multiple times. And it is only when they were dead, they were killed, both were killed in the battlefield. So they were continuously fighting all through their lives. And only when they died that Muhammad was able to, pass over to Multan. So this is a heroic story which we were never told. We were only told about Muhammad coming and conquering our territories as he wished. Now, about the Hindu Shahis, Al-Biruni, just a decade or so later, who visited India as a traveler, he writes that in all their grandeur, the Hindu Shahis never slackened in their ardent desire of doing that which is good and right, and that they were men of noble sentiment and noble bearing. Now, this is something a scholar from the Muslim side is saying about Hindu Shahis. So, as I was reading this chapter, only one thing came to my mind, that the tenacity of these guys is amazing. And they're very small kings. They're a very small army, and they don't have the kind of resources that Muhammad had. Muhammad also had the support of the Abbasid Caliph, which is pretty much ruling the whole of Central Asia and Babylonia and Iraq, etc. But these guys had the support of Rajputs only once, because the next time the Rajputs didn't come together. Still, they stood in their own right. They blocked Muhammad of Ghazni from crossing Sindh and getting to Multan. And as long as they're alive, Muhammad was not able to cross the Indus River and go to Multan. So it's an ironclad defense, and this is something we should have been taught. Unfortunate that no one knows about this. Now, now that the Hindu Shahs are dislodged, Muhammad goes and tries to attack the Chandelas. Now, Chandelas are seated in two places: Kilanjar, which is in the border of Madhya Pradesh and Uttar Pradesh, the current states, and that is an area called Bundelkhand. And the other capital of them is Khajuraho, where they build beautiful temples, right? So, if I'm not wrong, the temples of Khajuraho were not destroyed. Very few, I believe, are destroyed, or damages happened to only very few, because the Chandela defense was so perfect that when Muhammad Ghaznavi marched against them, the king Vidyadhara, in 1018, this is almost 17 years after his first attempt to conquer Multan. So he sends a messenger to the Hindu king Vidyadhara and asks him to either convert or submit himself. Then the Chandela king says that, okay, whatever we have to talk, we'll talk in the battlefield, in a typical Rajput kind of a reply. Now, this is again a lost opportunity for us, because when they meet in the battlefield, Muhammad surveys the Hindu army from his side, and he figures out that this is an extraordinary army, and he won't be able to make even a small dent to it, right? So, and he makes a retreat. He just leaves. Now, at this point, the Chandelas could have pursued Muhammad and finished him off before he crossed Indus, right? But they didn't do it because it's not as per the Rajput code of honor to attack a retreating enemy. Now, we are in a morally and from a code of conduct point of view, we are in a pretty high moral plane compared to the barbarians who are coming from the northwest. So I'll also try and show the map that I've put together for this particular battle. I mean, the reason I'm switching between maps and PPT is, if you look at the map, you'll probably get a better idea of the topography. So again, he came all the way from Ghazni, and now this time he had Multan, because the Hindu Shahis have been dislodged. Multan is under his control, and then he crosses over because the Rajputs, they don't put a tough fight at this point of time, and then he comes here. This is this is the place where the Chandelas are situated. So he lays siege to the Kilanjar Fort, or Kalinjar Fort. I'm sorry for my mispronunciation, in Madhya Pradesh. For 40 days, I believe he lays siege to the fort, but he was not able to make a single dent to it. And then he goes away, and then he goes to Gwalior. He tries to lay siege to the Gwalior fort. Again, nothing happens there because they're super strong forts. And when the Chandela and the Gwalior armies wanted to come to the battlefield, he flees. He goes back because he realizes that it will be a mistake to engage with the army at this point, which is too formidable. So again, he goes all the way back to Ghazni, and we have this much of terrain where we could have finished him off from point C here all the way till B. We could have finished him anywhere, but for some reason, the Rajput Code of Honor doesn't allow that. Right? Okay, let me switch back. So Muhammad's campaign against the Chandelas is a failure. He had to go. He didn't get anything out of it. He probably would have spent a lot of money during the campaign, but nothing comes out of it. So far, except having a hold in Multan, Muhammad couldn't get a single penny out of India. Again, as I said, Gwalior and Kalinjar force, they refused to budge. The Muslim chroniclers say that they don't say that Muhammad of Ghazni had to make a retreat because the enemy army is so formidable. What they say is they just exchange pleasantries and they just exchange gifts, and then they go back. Now, that is a whitewashing of history done by the Muslim historians. Next, at this point, after figuring out that invading the mainland India, the heart of India, which is the present day Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan and all, is extremely difficult, that's when he makes a raid on Somnath. Now, again, as we all know, he was able to successfully raid Somnath, and he demolishes the main idol there. He desecrates the temple, he plunders, because Somnath, the temple apparently contained enormous wealth. So he loots a large part of it, and he goes back. But how did this happen? Now, it didn't happen the way I said. I just said the way history books say, that he comes and he loots Somnath. So I'll probably again share the Somnath campaign map so that we'll have a better idea as to what actually happened. Sorry, can you see this? Can you see the map again?
Yes.
Yes, we
Okay.
can see.
Okay, so after retreating from the Chandelas and the Gwalior Rajputs, he again comes back from Ghazna. Sorry. And he camps at Multan. So Multan is here. Yes, B is Multan. He camps here, he replenishes his supplies. Now what he does is, he realized that his earlier experience of going, touching Delhi and any of these Rajputs, Jaipur and all is difficult, because they were giving very tough resistance to him, that his movement is extremely difficult. So what he does is, he does the impossible. So here you see the Thar Desert in Rajasthan. So he, from Multan, instead of going through the typical trade routes, he chooses to cross the desert. Now there are two objectives here. If you're crossing the desert, you will not face any resistance, in between. And also you can add an element of surprise to your campaign. So he crosses the desert. You must have, endured a lot of difficulties while crossing the desert, because it's not easy to do that. But again, he dared to do that. Now he goes right between, most probably he goes right between Jodhpur and Ajmer, without alerting them, very calmly going here. And then he comes to this place called Patan in Gujarat. Now there's an ancient name, it's called Anihilapura. Now Patan is ruled by the Chalukyas at that point in time. Now they were caught by surprise, because they didn't get news from any of their Rajput neighbors, because this guy came from, because this is the route of least resistance. So he takes the path of least resistance and comes to Patan. And again, being caught by surprise, the king of Patan makes a retreat to Kantkot, which is to the west of Patan. Now, while uh, Muhammad's idea is to go to Somnath directly and plunder it, because that is the place. G is the point. G is where Somnath is. But then again, while on the way to Somnath, from Kantkot, King Bhima the first, he sends his army and engages with Muhammad here at D and F. Points D and F is D is Modhara, and F is Devla. Now here, um, uh, again, Muhammad was able to achieve a victory, but he was so scared at the end of the battle. The king Bhima retreats back to Kantkot after the setback. Uh, Muhammad is so scared that he just wants to go to Somnath. He doesn't want to occupy the territory. He doesn't want to stay there. He simply plunders, takes whatever he can, and he had to return back to Multan. Now, ideally, you would imagine that he would have wanted to take the path of least resistance, which is going back through the desert. But by the time he is at Somnath, he hears from his spies that the Malwa region here, where you see Indore and all this area, the king of Malwa, Bhojaraja, the Parmara king, has already assembled. He got the news of the plunder of Somnath, and he's a great Shiva Bhakta. I mean, you can see the great temples that he built in Ujjain, right? So he already assembles a huge army, and Muhammad gets an accurate account of the enemy that he's going to face. Now, the Muslim chroniclers again say that he was so scared that he doesn't want to take the route back again. Rather, he takes the route which is utterly dangerous. Now he has to go back with all the plunder in hands, cross Delwada, which is here, the Delwada, which is where, and Kantkot, which is where he encountered Bhima, and cross over. I mean, the border doesn't exist, but he wants to cross over to Sindh, which is called Brahmanabad or Mansura at that point in time, because the Arabs earlier, few centuries ago, had set up a shop there, and it's called Mansura. Now, what happens is, while going back, he was again encountered by the soldiers of the army of King Bhima at Kantkot and here at Delwada. He escapes them. He literally runs away from them. He doesn't even engage. He doesn't engage. And in the pursuit, the Muslim historians say that a number of Islamic soldiers were slaughtered by King Bhima, because he doesn't want to engage, because he knows King Bhima has taken enough time and he has replenished his reserves. And from the east side, King Bhoja is ready to kill him anytime. So he literally runs away from the scene, and he tries to go back to Sindh. And on the way, he somehow crosses Gujarat. And on the way, Sindh part, Brahmanabad, was inhabited by the Jats. Now the Jat generals and the tribesmen, they harass him on the way. As in, they simply, again, he doesn't want to engage with the Jats at that point in time, because any kind of battle at that point in time will result in a sure shot defeat for Muhammad. So he doesn't engage with them, and the Jats were, freely taking hold of the Muslim armies and harassing them all the way to Brahmanabad, which is called Mansura at that point in time. Now, I'll again go back. So Muhammad's retreat from his greatest plunder, we keep reading about Muhammad's plunder in India. The only plunder he was able to get was from Somnath, because in all other campaigns, while the Hindus did not have a decisive victory, Muhammad was not able to gain a single penny, except for capturing Multan. The only plunder he was able to amass was from Somnath. And even from Somnath, he had to have a disgraceful retreat. He had to literally run for his life. Now, there is also a story narrated by Dr. Mishra, where two guides who were supposed to guide them to Brahmanabad or Mansura, instead they guide them into the desert. So they get trapped in the desert, and and a lot of Muslim army gets killed there, right? So So that's the story of Somnath. Now, this is pretty much similar to, as I said, once he was on his way to Mansura, he was molested by Jats. Now, once Muhammad is back in Sindh, especially in Mansura, there is a Jat invasion of Sindh. The Jats invade the province of Mansura, Brahmanabad. They take over, and Muhammad, Muhammad leaves from that place, leaving one of his generals there. Now, the general was caught by the Jats, and the Muslim chroniclers say that the Jats forced the Musalman Amir to abjure his religion, which means that, kind of ghar wapsi. And later, we hear from Hindu sources. The Muslim sources are completely silent over this. The Chalukya Bhima, who engaged with Muhammad at Delwada and Kantkot, he wanted to take revenge for what Muhammad did to Somnath. So he invades Sindh. He captures Mansura, Brahmanabad, and then he completely overthrows the Muslim Amir or Muslim general there. Now, these are the two things which were never taught because much of our history is written from a Muslim point of view. Two different Hindu chroniclers mention this. One, Hemachandra, who is contemporary to King Bhima, and the other one later, a couple of centuries later, even Merutunga, another Hindu chronicler, also mentions this invasion of the Chalukya invasion of Sindh. Now, this reminded me again, when we started, we spoke about Achaemenid Empire and Alexander's incursions into India. Now, after the Battle of Hydaspes, where Alexander engaged with Parvateshwar or Porus, again, we were told that Alexander is victorious, but Hindu sources are absolutely silent. The Hindu sources doesn't even record that someone like an Alexander came to the borders of India. He was so irrelevant in India. We didn't even record, not even an inscription, not even in any of our legends. Now, from the Battle of Hydaspes, which happened on the banks of the river, he turns southward because he wanted to reach the Arabian Ocean, Arabian Sea, build ships there, and go back to Greece. That was his plan. Now, there he was encountered again at Multan. At that point in time, Multan was ruled by a small tribe called the Malli tribe. They're Hindus. Megasthenes mentions in his chronicles that the Mallis are Hindus. Here, Alexander was almost, as you can see from the picture that I have here on my screen, he was almost killed. In fact, he was so wounded that he had to be carried all the way from that place, from Multan to the ocean, which is Arabian Sea. And till the time he was put on the ship, he was unconscious. So the Malli tribesmen, they shoot arrows into Alexander's chest, and his retreat from Sindh was, it was quite disgraceful for the kind of warrior that they show Alexander as. So Muhammad of Ghazni also had a similar kind of a disgraceful retreat from Somnath, from India, which is the only plunder he was able to amass. Now, what was happening in the rest of India? Now, even today, historians, even today, like Cynthia Talbot and all, say that Prithviraj Chauhan, was the last Hindu king. And once Muhammad Ghori overthrew Prithviraj Chauhan, India fell into Muslim hands. Now, that is bullshit, because Prithviraj Chauhan is one of the Rajputs. There are many other Rajputs, and then there are the Parmaras, the Bhojas, the Cholas, Chairas. India is huge, right? So what's happening in the rest of India? In deep south, the Chola Empire rose at the same time when Muhammad of Ghazni was invading. And Rajaraja Chola, the greatest of Chola emperors, he has built an empire which covered the entire South India, which covered all the way up to Orissa, and he went all the way to Bengal and Bihar, and he brings, he conquers all the territory. Not just that, he also goes to Southeast Asia, as you can see in this map. The blue part is the core Chola territories, and the pink part is where the Cholas have their influence, which means their generals are there and they're collecting taxes. So pretty much large part of Southeast Asia was also under the Chola rule. So now this large kingdom, it generated so much of revenues that they built magnificent temples. If you ever go to South, you'll see these beautiful temples, huge, and which would not have been possible without the kind of wealth that Cholas were amassing. If you look at what Muhammad of Ghazni built in Afghanistan, in Ghazni, is nothing. I mean, it's not even 1/10, probably even 100, right? Now, Rajaraja Chola's son, Rajendra Chola, he again went all the way up till Bengal and Bihar and carried Ganga from there. Now, this is the time the successors of Muhammad were able to make an incursion all the way to Bihar, east of Patliputra, which is Patna. Now, the reason I brought this up is I just wish, history was different, right? I just wish, the successors of Muhammad of Ghazni met with the army of Rajendra Chola, who would have completely decimated Ghazni out there, because the kind of influence these the rest of the Hindu kings were having in the other parts of India was so massive. The reason I'm again bringing this up is Alexander was not able to make his forays into India because there existed a huge kingdom called Magadha, right? Similarly, the Achaemenids couldn't do it because the Shishunaga kingdom was there. By the time Muhammad of Ghazni came, the large kingdoms have disintegrated into Rajput principalities. Now, I believe that is one of the reasons for these foreign raids into India. Had North India had a kingdom like Cholas, or at the time of Muhammad's incursions, he would have been killed right there. This is my understanding, and I wish history was different. And again, after Muhammad of Ghazni plundered Somnath in west of India, the later Cholas they were so prosperous, they built 168 temples, huge temples across South India. So what I'm trying to project here is Prithviraj Chauhan is not the last great emperor, because they wanted to make Muhammad of Ghori a huge hero. They say that the entire India was conquered. They conquered only a small principality called Delhi and Ajmer, not more than that at that point in time. The rest of India was in a different state. I just wish that the whole of India was under one single rule. A formidable defense would have been put up, and the invaders would have been rooted out. So that's pretty much my presentation, and thanks for hearing me out. Thanks for listening me out. I didn't get a chance to look at the questions. There are so many questions here, but I'll open it to any Q&A.
I have a question, sir. Am I audible?
Yes,
Sure.
Yes. Yes. See, when we talk of our Indians being taken as slaves, as loot, because that's al-ghanim according to the Quran. So if they were to be taken and they suffered so much, and we say the Hindu Kush mountains are mentioned by that name because that means Hindus got slaughtered there in those passes. And certainly that would be going via Afghanistan into the slave markets of Central Asia and beyond. So taking so many slaves along, was it mostly Muhammad Ghazni or Muhammad Ghori later on? And we have Kanha Dade Prabandha written about Jalore. I do not recollect whether it was in the time of Muhammad Ghazni or sometime much later, but they were all Turkic people. They were all Turkic people. So this is one question, because if they had all these campaigns where this Ghaznavi lost most of the time, and he managed to loot one main treasure, which was the Somnath temple. We need to know whether this is the time when we lost most of our population as slaves, or whether that enslavement happened in later invasions, because he had so many campaigns.
Yeah, at least from the Ghazni's campaign. I mean, I read this book, and I also did some independent research. Because much of the history at that point in time comes from Muslim sources, and very little from Kalhanas, Raj, Tarangini, and other Hindu sources, but mostly from Muslim sources, Farishta and others. They haven't mentioned any slaves being taken back, at least at the time of Ghazni. Maybe it happened later. I'm not very sure about it.
Yeah, just to
this happens much later, Nadir Shah and all those things, I think.
Yeah, and actually, what happens is, what I understand from them even is there is one extreme exaggeration of numbers. Like if you see after the first battle of, I mean the first battle, 1001, in which the Hund, that is the Udbandapur the army of Udbandapur is defeated. The Muslim chronicler mentions about 5 lakh people being enslaved. Now, which is a very I mean absurd numbers, because the point is a city, and even a capital city of those areas in a small principality, even if I consider the entire population was being enslaved and taken away, it couldn't have been 5 lakh. The number 5 lakh does not match. I mean, no one was sitting around the battle to watch like a cricket match or a football match, or 5 lakhs
Yeah.
who simply fell into their hands. I mean, so these are like extreme exaggerations. Uh, 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 yes, when actually since they had also a, I mean, the Muslim armies always had two intentions, rather three intentions. First, definitely to establish their kingdom, conversion, and extract money and taxes. If not possible, plunder the immediate riches. And the third is to create a terror mindset among the local populace for their supremacy. That is how they wanted to I mean, exert themselves. That was the mindset of all the invading Muslim armies. Now, in doing that, slaughtering of people or slaughtering of common people in areas around the forts or just outside the forts was not very uncommon. Or maybe some people being taken slaves. An army, I mean, see, after all, if they take the slaves, they have two options. They will have to take the slaves and make money out of it by either selling them or making them work for their kingdoms. They themselves are in shortage of food, water, and other supplies to cross over the retreat path for a few thousand soldiers. Obviously, they will lose all these people on their way and will never ever make an attempt to take 5 lakh people as slaves along with them. So these numbers are absolute exaggerations to, I mean, glorify their kings. I mean, because a king in the Muslim invasion is always glorified by the number of slaves he captured and the number of people he killed. So that's why I mean, the chroniclers, the official chroniclers of the Muslim historians make I mean, exorbitant numbers. So when you see the total army is around 30,000, 40,000, you cannot have 5 lakh people watching them in a battle. So those are like absolute absurd numbers that they put.
True, true. Even in third battle of Panipat, where pretty much the entire Maratha army perished, and almost 60,000 of the Muslim army also perished. It's only 1 lakh, right? So 5 lakhs way back in 1000
Right.
AD is completely
Yeah, those are
unbelievable.
absolute unbelievable, absolute exaggerations. And even today, I mean, like a simple example I can give, like even Napoleon times, that is 1813 and all, in the Battle of Austerlitz, they say thousands and thousands of Russian soldiers drowned in the lake, in the frozen lake. Modern estimates figured out it was around 200. So you can understand the I mean, the exaggeration of the official chronicler that they give. I mean, the propaganda that they give to make their ruler or their, I mean, leader as a supreme person in a battle.
This also poses a problem because we have to be realistic, because let us never move away from truth. You can be poetic about things, but you cannot exaggerate things as the only figure of speech. I completely agree with you, Abhijit ji. But this also poses a problem, because when we want to have realistic, undistorted history, we on one hand do want to document our genocide, because there was a genocide of us culturally, physically, and other ways. We were ethnically cleansed out. It's going on even today. But we do not want the data we provide to state this truth to also be exaggerated. We want it to be realistic. So I quite agree with you, but it's then going to pose a problem as to how we actually get the real possible figures. While we may agree that exaggerations are there all the time, but there is no denial that genocide took place and slaughter took place, enslavement took place. How do we actually have a methodology of going for realistic figures to bring up a narrative?
So,
So
Aditya,
I think around Somnath temple, at least the existing history says that about 50,000 people were slaughtered. But
Hmm.
it doesn't say that people were captured and enslaved, at least at that point in time.
Okay. Okay.
Because those who were defending the temple, they were ready to give their lives than allowing the marauder to take over the temple and convert them. Maybe it happened in later times.
So
Yes.
I
as
think
far
in later times we pretty much see, even Malik Kafur was a Hindu, right? He was converted and enslaved. So they must have enslaved people, but at the same time they must have empowered them by allowing them to loot whatever they can, giving them free hand to loot their Hindu brothers, ex-Hindu brothers or whatever. So it must have happened in later stages
No,
for sure.
they themselves are a slave dynasty, right? I think this one or Gauri, I do not know.
Mamluk dynasty is a slave dynasty.
Yes.
Delhi Sultanate
Yeah.
is a slave dynasty.
Yeah,
So-
even
so-
even Sabuk Tagin is a slave.
yes,
So
yes,
Abuk Tajin is the slave of Alaptajin, I guess, his master.
Yes.
But the thing is, this is not, these are not Pakhtuns then. They may come in the Loya Jirga today of Afghanistan, but then they are not Pakhtuns by ancestry. They are Turks
They're
by
Turks.
ancestry
They're Turks. Yeah, that's
who have
They're
tried to
actually-
get themselves, yeah.
Yes, actually they're the Turks. I mean, although they are called Afghans, if it's basically it is called the Turko-Afghans. Now, Turks, if you see the Hindu Kush mountains, the province of Farghana, which is supposed to be the hometown of Babar and all the stuff, lies exactly on the other side of the Hindu Kush mountains, which is a
In fact,
Turkish area.
north even of Pamir, I think, or I think it's
correct.
between Pamir and Hindu Kush. So it may be Tajikistan or
Right.
Turkmenistan.
So
Exactly.
The Oxus River is where these people come from. So it's called
Wakhan corridor is south of it, and Tajikistan is north of it.
is north of it.
Correct. Not exactly. The Tajik. Even today, if you see the Afghanistan civil war, it is this Abdul Rostam is basically an Uzbek lord. It's basically a Turkish guy.
Yes, yes.
Rostam. They have the Tajik lords. They have the Uzbek warlord. So that belt, that is a Turkish belt. Actually, the Turkistan or the Turk belt exists from the Xinjiang province of China
Up to Turkey.
up to Turkey. So there are.
Yes.
This is the Central Asia belt of the Central Asian Turkish belt. So
Yes,
and
but one thing to say, Tajikistan is slightly different from all these other Central Asian states. Tajikistan is a Persian outreach. They speak Tajik, which is a dialect of Persian, but all the other states, Xinjiang, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Azerbaijan, and Turkey, they all are Central Asian language speakers. And Tajikistan has proudly maintained its Persian identity, and it was part of USSR, but it was not Turkic itself. And in some previous presentation, we have said the Tajiks were Arabs. The Tajiks are not Arabs; they are Persians.
No. Okay. No. Okay. The Tajiks are not Arab. Okay. When there was the thing is the mention about the Tajika army, the Tajika, the literature, the ancient literature of the Tajika army, the Hindu chroniclers put them as a Tajika army, the Tajika Sena. The Tajika Sena is mentioned as Arab Sena is mentioned as Tajika Sena in the Hindu literature. In the literature, it's not that we are not mentioning Tajiks as Arabs, but we are saying the Tajika army, the Tajika Sena, as mentioned in the Hindu chronicles, is they are mentioning about the Arab. Now, as you mentioned, even the southern parts of Azerbaijan, they speak kind of Turkish and a Persian mix. Is a mix of Persian and Turkish, because there are a lot of Persian people staying in the southern part of Azerbaijan. There are some Turkish people staying in the northern part of Iran. So as happens in the border areas, even if you see the Shahi kingdom and the sun temples of the Shahi kingdom are mentioned more on Zun temples, or the language that they use is Zun.
Zun.
Exactly.
Yeah, and Zun or Zunbil was the deity of the sun temple destroyed in Zabul. Zabulistan, Zunbil. I mean, these all match sun god, but that word is a Turkish language.
It's actually a Persian language. It's not exactly
a Persian language. Okay. Because in Kashmiri, Zun is moon.
Right. So the Zun, Persian, when I say again, Persian has two stages of Persian. Like the current Persian that the Iranian Persian is more of an Arabic Persian. If you see the Arabic script and everything, this is the pre-Arabic, the pre-Arabic, the original Persian, the Persian
Yes, yes.
language that we speak.
Pre-Islamic,
So that
pre-Islamic.
the pre-Arabic. Basically, Islamic is Arabic. I mean, basically,
Yes.
Islamic is an Arabic culture. Even the name Muhammad is not an Islamic name; it's an Arabic name. Since
Yes,
Muhammad has established the religion of Islam, and so it became an Islamic name, but basically
Yes.
it is an Arabic name. The name Muhammad
Otherwise, a
existed-
lot of Muslim names are actually Jewish names, which have got a twist
right.
in their rendering
yeah.
because
right,
it's a
right.
Yeah,
The region, it's regional.
In fact, another thing is the Shahis, which we are discussing today, these Shahis, because today's was all the Shahis. So the Shahis have been mentioned in some places as Hindu Turushkas, as Hindu Turks. Could you
yeah,
clarify
yeah.
this point?
The Hindu Shahis were preceded by the Turk Shahis, who were Buddhists.
Okay.
actually.
Okay,
Buddhist
The Turk
okay.
Shahis were Buddhist. They're a
So
mix
the
of
Shahi suffix continued, but they were not Turks themselves. They were so
Correct.
they would be classically Indic, basically.
They're all Indic.
Pakhtun.
And there's a quite interesting angle to it. It's only, say, it's not the first time that people from northwest of India and the Central Asia came to India and conquered Indian territories, right? So even during the Kushanas, they came from Central Asia.
Yes, yes, they did.
So many
Huns.
people. Even the Greeks, the Indo-Greeks
Shakas.
came from Central Asia. Shakas
Yes,
came
yes.
from Central Asia. But all
Yes.
of them, once they
Got
came into
defeated, they were
India,
digested. Yes.
they were digested. They all patronized Hinduism and Buddhism, predominantly
Yes.
Correct.
Hinduism and Buddhism. Even the Alcon Huns, who are supposed to be the ancestors of the current day Hungarians, even they are Shaivites. After they came
Yes.
to India, they
Yes.
became Shaivites. It's only the
Yes.
Abrahamic religions which are completely, fundamentalist in their outlook and
Yes.
impose their views on the local populations. Even
Correct.
Genghis Khan, who is supposed to be the dreaded invader, he was
He was
religiously
not a Muslim.
He was not a Muslim. He was religiously tolerant. It's only his sons who took up Islam, which is the religion of the conquered land.
I don't know if his own sons took it or still later descendants. I do not know that.
Yeah.
They
Yes.
were probably
yes.
not the immediately next
Okay.
Yeah,
generation.
Genghis Khan's next one was Kublai Khan, who was his grandson.
Kublai Khan. Khanate used to call them, like we say, Emirate or
Yes.
Sultanate, we say Khanate.
Yeah. Yeah.
maybe not
Chugtai
his sons,
Khan,
but probably
Chugtai, Chagatai Turk.
Chugtai is a
Yeah.
little later, bro.
In fact,
Chugtai is a little like
Genghis,
In fact, the Mughals who we are known as, whom we know as the descendants of Babur, Babur's invasion is much, much later to the time we discussed today. But prior to
Right.
Babur, the Turks had got that particular branch of Turks which accepted Islam may have accepted it much, much later from the time of
Yes.
Ghazni.
correct.
So
Right.
they that particular branch had not got Islamized that early. They probably got Islamized in the later 12th century. So this is almost 200 years after the birth of Muhammad of Ghazni.
Yeah. So
actually,
Babur's great grandfather was Tamerlane or
Tamerlane, Taimurlan.
That's right.
And he accepted
And-
Islam in his own lifetime.
Correct. And Babur was also related to Genghis Khan from, I think, his father's or
Mother's side. Mother's side.
Mother's side is
So
Okay.
many generations ago.
yeah. So they are actually a Turco-Mongol generation. I mean, the
Right.
Turco-Mongol lineage. I mean, that's
Yes.
what the mixing happens because
No.
So what amazes me is that while previous invaders from the same region, while they invaded here, fought with our Hindu kings and all, at some point in time they accepted the local customs, local religion, and they patronized the local religion. Whereas Abrahamic religions and especially Islam, it's hell-bent on eliminating anything other than Islam and imposing their religion on the local populace.
yes, if you see Lakshmi ji, it's not just about the Abrahamic is the right word I would say, because it's not just about the Islamists.
Muslims.
If you,
Yes.
Yeah.
it's not just about the
Christians.
Muslims. Even the Christians, if you see, they the Charlemagne, whose burial lies in today's city of Aachen, Germany, on the border of Germany and Holland. Now, Charles, he's basically Charlemagne is not his main name is Charles the Magnificent. So that's how the Charlemagne comes.
Charlemagne. Yeah.
So
Charlemagne.
Charlemagne. So the Charlemagne actually murdered thousands of pagans. I mean, the idol worshippers.
Saxon English pagans.
I mean, yeah. So
and
basically,
other
English
parts
are not.
also. Yeah,
Yeah. I mean, basically,
Goths.
all the pagans,
Saxon is
all the
German. I
pagans.
think. Saxon is
Yeah,
German.
Saxon is German. In fact, the English are the Celtics. I mean, the British
Correct.
are the Celtic.
No,
Now,
the
whatever.
no, the English are not Celtic. The English and Scots are Germanic. The Welsh and Irish are Celtic.
No. Actually, it's a slightly different. The point is, the English are. The original English were the Celtic and the Irish. Now, what happens is, first the Brittany, that is Britain, comes from Brittany, which is French.
Hmm.
Anglican, which is French, Saxony, which is French, and Norman, and the Norman invasion of 1066, which
Normandy.
is Norman. Sorry, Saxony and Anglican is German, and Normandy and Norman is French. So nothing English about England. So
Yes, yes.
so
No, but
I'm coming to
the English were defeated at the times of Roman times itself when Romans
yes,
invaded England.
yes,
But that was
yes.
prior to
Captured
Christian
Boracay.
invasions.
Yeah,
There
no,
was a
that is
pre-Christian presence of Romans in England. But I
Correct.
would
Right.
like to add one point here, sir. When we talk of the Turks invading India, getting successful initially, establishing rule, then getting defeated by indigenous kings, and then getting digested into a society with no trace of their Turkish culture left. This is the truth we are taught. Not that this is wrong, but there is a reciprocal to this across the Himalayas. There were parts of Vedic Bharat which were Vedic with some Buddhist presence, and this part was getting Turkicized. It was getting Turkicized, Mongolized, and Tibetanized, and this process continued well beyond the time of Muhammad Ghazni. So when we talk of Afghanistan in such detail, we should not fail to know that there was a repeated attempt at Tibetanization of India, Turkicization of India, and this has been going on for centuries. Had Samrat Lalitaditya not tried, much prior to Islam reaching there in the 14th century, in the 8th century itself, Srinagar would have become Turkic had he not been
But
there.
what was the religion? Let's say.
No, they were pagans and they accepted Buddhism. But when they invaded, they crept more and more to the west into Vedic territory, and they went on Tibetanizing and Turkicizing our religion and our faith. And they accepted Buddhism. See, this is prior to Islam, and this is even prior to Buddhism, or even regardless of existing Buddhism. They would convert our language away, they would hybridize our ethnic population away, and this is an aspect of invasion from the eastern side which we are not aware of, and it continued well beyond the fall of Afghanistan. In
Yes,
fact,
true.
Kishtawar part of Jammu had been occupied by Tibetan forces much later from the time we were discussing today, much after Anandapal and Jayapal. Some of the parts of Western Tibet have been under Indic hold and they were lost out as late as the 14th century.
Yes, but at the same point of time, if you see the Buddhism, the original Madhyapantha Buddhism or the middle path Buddhism of Gautama Buddha, and the later Buddhism or the Tantric Buddhism that then existed both in Tibet, in Tibet, in Tibet, as well as a Theravada Buddhism, the Tantric Buddhism, and in fact, it was more the Tantric and the Tantric Buddhism which spread all across the world. It's not the middle path Buddhism that spread into Far East and the Indo-China belt. So it was a Tantric. So now what happened was, what I understand is that there were two types of religions. One is the Abrahamic that we talk about. The other is the Indic the Indic religions or the Indic pagan religion, which had a much bigger influence. The Abrahamic religions were like the Jewish, the Christians, and the Muslims in that order, which always believed in killing the people, forcing the people, obliterating the local populace, and creating a fear mongering to convert. That was the Abrahamic religion. The Indic religion spread is all about the cultural spread, be it Indochina, be it in the Tibet. It is all about the cultural spread, the inner, the distribution of inner peace. The basic inner strength, and that is where, and the different ways of achieving it. See, if you see if you see that's the practices, and those are the things that have been spread by the Indic religion. So that's where the Buddhist religion if you see the Buddhist religion which believes in rebirth and all other things, yes, there are conflicts, some of the conflicts and all. And even then, I mean, there is no tantric, the tantric Buddhism or I mean original Buddhism. There is no deity. There is no I mean no deity as such. But later on, as the tantric Buddhism spreads, as the Theravada Buddhism spreads, the deity culture comes into them. So they believe in the ways of the Hinduism, and so the Buddhism that spread is more about, okay, I being the king, you listen to what I say. Yes, that has happened. That has happened from the ruling side, but it has never been the monotheistic ruthlessness of the Abrahamic people that has happened from of the Abrahamic religion. So this is the difference between the Indic religions and the Abrahamic religions, and that has what has captured. And definitely being the northwest part of the India and the Central Asia being the converging places of these two conflicting mindsets, these areas have gone through more turmoil than maybe other parts of the continent or the world.
Yes.
So,
See, we can project this history which we have today about how the Turkic people who were slaves by dynasty, who were freed, Subuktakin, Aliptakin and all of them, and who invaded, who were Jayapala, Anandapala, who were the Hindu Shahis. We can actually project this as a Turkish Muslim invasion onto Hindu Pakhtuns, because these people are Hindu Pakhtuns. The Shahi people are Hindu Pakhtuns. And what would have happened to those Pakhtuns who did not accept Islam? They had to flee because they did not accept Islam, and they would have either remained as a minority or they would have fled. So where would they have fled? They would have fled into Kashmir, into Punjab and into Sindh. Where would the Hindu Baloch have fled? They would have fled into Hindu Sindh, Hindu Kutch, Hindu Marwad. Okay, so I have a feeling the Pakhtun Brahmins became Punjabi and Kashmiri Brahmins. The Pakhtun Khatris became parts of the Punjabi Khatris. So they only changed their mother tongue and Pehnava. They did not change their dharma, and they maintained their jati and varna also. This is probably what must have happened. If we have the dynasty of Trilochan Pala having a maiden ancestry to Kashmir, it is because of this. And it also goes out to say that these Shahis were probably Brahman Shahis of Pakhtun. Pakhtuns have a Hindu this thing. Yeah.
I remember somewhere, I think one of the Muslim travelers during the Hindu Shahi time mentions that the king, Hindu Shahi king, was a Brahmin.
Yes,
Exactly. Yeah, they were
And-
Brahmins. If you in my last presentation, I think I mentioned that.
Okay.
So
okay.
it was 1856, if I'm not wrong, when the Turko Shahi or the Buddhist Shahi got converted into a bloodless coup by the Brahman Shahi in 1856. And the Anandapala 856.
Yes.
856, and it was post that the first after the fall of Kabul, they moved to Udbandhapur, and 958 AD, I mean that was covered in the last thing, is the 958 or 968 AD is when Anandapala attacked Ghazni, heart of Ghazni. So they attacked across the border and attacked, and it was only an inclement weather that created a stalemate, in which Sabuktagin agreed for peace, which was later denied by Mahmud Ghazni. So it is not that we had attacked, and they were decimated in their borders, they were decimated in Ghazni, and only at the later point of time that peace was denied, and Mahmud of Ghazni could attack only in 1001. So there was also another 968 or 78. I mean, it was there in my last presentation. So around that time, we attacked Ghazni itself. So
we have attacked, counter-attacked also. That's really very nice.
Yes, we have
and there was that WhatsApp which was going around about King Suhail Deva Pasi king. So these people were not Brahmins. In fact, he may be what you may call a Shudra, but he was a king, and he was also inclined towards Jain Dharma. And he raised an army, and there was that WhatsApp circulating, and Yogi Adityanath ji has done some memorial for him, I think, for Suhail Dev Pasi. And these people are very proud Hindus, and the persons they were fighting were the generals of the armies of one of these Turkish invader Muslims.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether those were
Uh,
Ghazni or Gauri. I think they were Ghazni.
I didn't come across Suhail Pal.
Aditya ji and Avijit ji. So, okay, couple of things. First of all, is that we are running short of time. So sorry, I
Yes,
always play the
yes.
spoil sport. I'm being very sorry for this. But just wanted to set
Why
the
using
tone
it?
for the next chapter. The next
Yes.
chapter, and there are, I can see there are, some new participants today. So just to inform all of you that all these recordings of the last three the last three presentations, and also today, is going to our YouTube channel. So this will be
Yes.
uploaded by tomorrow, I am hoping. So if you want to catch up on the previous chapters, please do so. And next week we will cover chapter 4, which is perfidy wins where valor failed. So this, I think, is a very, very important chapter. So, and Lakshmi ji has been saying that the Rajput code of honor and how it has not served us time and again. And there will be many more, there will be many more such anecdotal examples where the Muslim army deliberately used our Swabhav and Swadharma to beat us. They
Exactly.
deliberately did this. Yeah. So,
Absolutely,
these are
absolutely.
the of history. These are so. So, in general, people, one question that people can ask is, oh, why study this? This has been done. So, these are lessons of history. So, the next three chapters, the last three chapters. So, the fourth chapter is on this. The fifth this chapter is the lessons. The fifth chapter is actually called the lessons we have to learn. And the sixth
Exactly.
chapter, the last chapter, is the nature of national frontiers. So we have an exciting set of 3 weeks coming up. So I request all of you to please mark this time, save this time, Saturday 7:30. So
I
we'll
look
have
forward to this time slot.
yes, yes. And maybe
In
Kiran,
fact,
okay, please, Abhijit, yes.
yeah, no, actually, Kiranji had rightly said that Shivaji Maharaj was the first to understand the real motive of these scoundrels. You cannot fight. Chivalry with scoundrels. So Shivaji Maharaj, in fact, in history, was the first to find out that okay, like deceit has to be fought with deceit. So that's
Yes.
exactly
You
correct.
can't be just with unjust people. You can't be kind with unkind people. You can't be constitutional with non-constitutional people.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
So we forgot in some way, we forgot the lessons in the middle, and so we should not. We are in a very critical time as well. We are doing
We
the
are
same.
still trying to solve the Bengal problem by asking for precedence rule as if it's going to work.
That's an interesting discussion. So maybe I'll request Kiranji to just conclude today's session. I'm assuming, if there are some quick questions from somebody else, or we can take it up next week. So maybe Kiranji, it's close to 9 o'clock. So maybe Kiranji. Kiranji, your voice is, you are not audible.
No?
Yes,
You are
now,
audible
now.
now.
Yeah, we can hear you.
You can hear me now. Okay. So it was an excellent presentation as usual, and very, very diverse, opinions from so many people. It is a wonderful satsang of Deshbhaktas, and I think, as usual, we have to force ourselves to close the session. And we look forward to the next one.
This is really the sad part, that we have to force ourselves because we wish to go on, but
See,
so that
after Corona, we can all assemble at some camp somewhere and have a, there's a word for that in corporate lingo. Crash it out. No, what do they say?
It may not be practical,
For
but
now, later
we
on.
can think of it. We can think of it.
At some tiger resort in central India, maybe.
Yeah.
all right.
Yeah.
So maybe thank you all of you. Thanks,
Thank you.
Lakshmi ji, a fantastic
Thank
presentation
you.
with the maps and all these things. You made it very interactive.
Yes.
Visually that is a big impact than saying Udbandapur and Multan and
Yeah.
Gwalior and this. You see
Exactly.
the map, that actually brings out the history much more vividly. So
Actually,
thanks. So Avijit also started that same thing. He was also
Yes.
showing maps and this and this. So I mean, this is a great series, and I'm looking forward to the next week participation from all of you.
Absolutely.
All right, and just one more request once again: if you want to join the Voice of the Voice of India Academy WhatsApp group or Telegram group, please do get in contact with one of us, Kiranji, or Lakshmi Prasadji, or me, or I mean, there are other persons also, and we will very gladly have your company. Okay.
Thanks a lot.
All right.
Thank
Yeah,
Thank you. Thanks, Lakshmi. Great presentation.